Great. Okay. Hello then. Welcome everybody. What a pleasure to see you all here today. It's great to have so many of you here at LSE, and I also know there's a lot of people online as well. This is an event, our annual lecture, which is joint between the Department of Health Policy and LSE Health. I'm the current head of department for the Department of Health Policy, and my name's Andrew Street, and that's all I'm going to say about myself. But I'd also like to thank Professor Elias Mosialis, who's director of LSE Health, who helped organize the event and invite Michelle to be with us. And I'd also like to thank Annabelle Fenton, who's the communications manager at LSE Health, who among other people has helped put this event together, but has led much of the organization. So thanks very much, Annabelle. It's a real pleasure, Michelle, to invite you here today. Michelle Williams is now at Stanford University, which she joined in January, where she's professor of epidemiology and population health. Prior to that, she was a number of years at Harvard, at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She had the dubious privilege of being dean of faculty for seven years. And before that, she was chair of the Department of Epidemiology. She led the Population Health and Health Disparities Research Program before that, which was based at the Harvard Clinical and Transitional Sciences Center, and also led the Global Nursing Leadership Program. Before she was at Harvard, she was at the University of Washington's School of Public Health, and while there, she received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering, which was awarded by President, he's not a professor as far as I know, President Barack Obama, remember? Oh, could we just turn back the clock? And in 2016, that was awarded in 2011, and in 2016, Michelle was elected to the United States National Academy of Medicine. She's a really prolific publisher. She's published more than 520 papers, I think, in places like The Lancet, Nature, Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, all the top field journals. She has a Google Scholar H index of, anyone give a guess? It's quite high, 127. That's a big number for people who don't follow Google Scholar things, but for academics we do. Her I-10 index, which is a subset, most recent publications, 681. Whoa! And she covers a lot of research into reproductive health, pediatrics, molecular epidemiology, molecular biomarkers, and the intersections between those areas. She's worked on lots of large-scale cohort studies, both in the US and abroad. She's worked in Zimbabwe, she's worked in Ethiopia. She's currently involved in the Apple Women's Health Study, and I think she'll be talking more about that and showing how digital health tools, biomarkers, integrated and innovative data systems can be used together to improve women's health around the world. And today is a particularly great day to have this session because, of course, yesterday was International Women's Day. So the timing of Michelle to fly in at lunchtime today, and she's flying out tomorrow. She's here for this short 24-hour window, and we are utterly honored that she has privileged us with her presence here today. So, a big round of applause, everybody, for Michelle Williams.
Thank you, Andrew, for that Wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much again, Andrew, for that introduction, if I may call you Andrew and Alias. I want to first begin by expressing my deep gratitude to the London School of Economics and Political Science for this invitation, and particularly the Department of Health Policy for the tremendous honor of delivering this annual lecture during the day around International Women's Day. To be invited to speak here at the school, a global leader in health policy research, and one of the institutions that has shaped how we think about the intersection of health, economics, and social justice is truly humbling and a great opportunity for me to engage with you all. I also want to acknowledge all of the distinguished colleagues, students, and guests joining today for this lecture. Your presence here reflects a shared commitment to the work that we're about to discuss over the next hour. So you can see that the title of my talk is Women's Health Matters, Science, Systems, and Global Change. And this lecture argues that women's health is fundamentally an economic and social justice issue, not merely a medical one. Before I begin, I want to share, in the interest of full transparency, my relevant affiliations. In addition to being a faculty member at Stanford University School of Medicine, I'm a member of the World Economic Forum's Women's Health Flagship Initiative and their Global Health Equity Network. I serve as a consultant for the Novartis Foundation, where I co-chair an AI for Healthy Cities Expert Advisory Board, and I sit on the board of directors for ICF International. These affiliations, all of them, inform my perspective and connect me to the global conversations happening at the intersection of health, technology, and policy. So now let me get to the heart of the matter. I want to share with you, walk through the journey that I will take you all in the next 50 minutes. My lecture is presented in 6 different areas. Why women's health demands a new science, and I'll open with the why now. The next section will be building the epidemiologic platform, and I will share how in my personal journey of research and program building, built a program around 3 conditions can you hear me? With devastating global burden. In section 3, I talk about integrating biochemistry and molecular biology into that platform so we can move the science along and understand how modifiable behavioral characteristics actually impact physiology and biology. In section 4, understanding structural determinants. And here I want to emphasize that the pathway to improving women's health is not solely an individual endeavor, but one that requires system-wide, institutional, and policy-level changes. I'm excited about the new frontier, and I want to talk about the revolution that's happening, that's transforming epidemiology and social science research. And here I'm talking about the vast tranche of real-world evidence that's being brought into our academic work, as well as the analytic and AI techniques that have promise but not yet realized, because we still have lots of work to do. And finally, I want to close with the imperative. And the imperative is discovery alone is not enough. It has never been enough. Science must translate into policy, into guidelines that save lives and improve lives. Okay, so let me start with the women's health gap. Why women's health demands a new science. Take a look at these figures. I really want you to be mindful of the figures here. $1 trillion annually. That is the estimated boost to the global economy by 2040 if we close the women's health gap. This comes from a rigorous analysis that was done in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the McKinsey Health Institute and was published just last year. Now, For me, this was an earth-shattering experience to be in academia and to watch the private sector economic community and the private sector consulting company come together and do something that we in academia had not been able to do alone. And that was to use the convening power of these international organizations and raise the level on the agenda, putting women's health higher on the level of the agenda. What also was important is the discussion about the impact of women's health expanded beyond the biology and the public health imperative and included the economic analysis. And what we saw from this work was that the return on investments for closing the gap, for every $1 spent invested in women's health, approximately $3 was generated in economic growth. Now, let's put that in human terms. The economic term was an important addition to the discussion, but the human term is what we can never forget, and that what we saw in the report was that women live longer than men. That's true. But what's also true is that women spend 12.5% more of their lives in ill health. 25% more times suffering debilitating conditions. If they closed this gap, we would give each woman an additional 7 years of healthy, 7 healthy days per year, over 500 days in a lifetime. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the research gap here. Consider this. In the United States, less than 9% of the National Institutes of Health grant funding over the past decade has been dedicated to women's health research. That's 9% for 51% of the population. And when we look beyond oncology, beyond cancer, at conditions that specifically affect women, conditions like endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, and severe menstrual disorders, only 1% of healthcare research and innovation is invested in these areas. 1%, that's not a typo on the slide. The National Academy of Sciences concluded just last year that we need $15.7 billion in new NIH funding over 5 years to simply begin closing the gap. Not to close the gap, but to begin doing something about the gap. Quite frankly, presently, we are not prioritizing the lives of women in the same way that we prioritize the lives of men. And I should note, similar patterns exist here in the United Kingdom. The Women's Health Strategy for England, published in 2022, acknowledged this systematic underinvestment. Recent NHS initiatives, for example, are beginning to address this, but progress remains rather slow. I'm going to give you a few specific examples. Okay, menopause. I want to talk about menopause. I mentioned it briefly. 26.4 or $26.6 billion per year is lost productivity and medical cost in the US alone. Globally, this cost of lost productivity is estimated to be $150 billion in productivity loss. Research from Stanford, for example, shows that 10% earning decline for women experiencing menopausal symptoms. 10% of their income, simply because we haven't invested adequately in understanding and treating this universal transition. I want to talk about endometriosis. Endometriosis accounts for $78 to $119 billion per year in economic burden in the United States. And here's what really breaks my heart. The average diagnostic delay, the diagnostic journey for a woman experiencing the symptoms that ultimately lead to the diagnosis of endometriosis is 7 to 10 years. 7 to 10 years, a woman is suffering for about a decade before receiving a diagnosis. This condition is not rare. It affects 190 million women worldwide, more than diabetes, yet the National Institutes of Health in the United States funding accounts for just $16 million. The next condition I want to emphasize and to show the economic burden of underinvestment is maternal mortality. Over 80% of maternal deaths in the United States are preventable. Yes, preventable. The economic burden reached $10.4 billion in 2020, a 30% increase in 2 years. The US maternal mortality rates are 3 times higher compared to their peer institutions, including the UK, Germany, and France. 3 times higher, and that's alarming given how much money the US system spends on healthcare. And in 2024 to 2025, 1.3 billion pounds here in the UK was paid out for maternal mortality-related clinical negligence claim. So although the UK is much better in comparison to the US, when we do a real comparison globally, even the UK's picture is deeply troubling. And the disparities by race and ethnicity are not very different. In the UK, Black women die at nearly 3 times the rate of their white counterparts during pregnancy. Okay, I want to turn my example, turn to a very stark example, not to be provocative, but to really highlight and illustrate the funding disparity that exists in women's health. So I just talked about endometriosis, a condition causing chronic pain, debilitating pain, infertility, and significantly diminishes the quality of life of nearly 200 million women globally. That condition receives only $16 million in total US funding, compared to the funding for researching erectile dysfunction, which receives 5 times more funding. That's a stark disparity. And the venture capital disparity, which I don't show on this slide, is even more striking, where the ratio of investment in sexual function technology for men versus women is 20 to 1. 20 to 1. Now, in the information, basic science information flows downstream, right? You start with the basic science investment, which you see a 5-fold difference. And that is amplified when you go to the R&D in the private sector, where that disparity is amplified to 20 to 1. If there's no basic science research for tech companies and biopharma companies to work with, then there is going to be relatively less venture capital money coming to addressing the problems of women's health. I want to be absolutely clear, however, that this is not about diminishing men's health outcomes. Men's health matters as well. But this comparison I show you to illustrate a dramatic structural imbalance in resource allocation that we cannot ignore. How did we arrive at a system that values research into conditions affecting women so much less than comparable conditions affecting men? This is a question we must confront, and we must do so honestly if we are about to bring change that closes the health disparities gap. So, having established the scope of this challenge, I now want to share my journey, my research journey in the field of women's health. And I will basically share with you that I have focused my work on understanding the etiology and pathophysiology of 3 conditions. And maybe some of you have heard about these. The 3 conditions that I've focused on in my own personal research are placental abruption, gestational diabetes, and preeclampsia. This journey has taken me across 4 continents, and I've had the privilege of building methodologically rigorous research networks spanning North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and South America. And together with extraordinary colleagues, we have contributed impactful papers to scientific literature work that has changed clinical practice and influenced policy, and I will share some of that with you. But this is what I learned along the way. Epidemiology gave me the platform. Epidemiology taught me to see patterns in populations and to identify risk factors to quantify burden. Biochemistry and genomics gave me the tools to understand mechanisms that underlie the associations that we can describe using epidemiologic measures. But the attention really should focus on the social determinants. To build the attention and to build the focus on the social determinants, to look at the role of intimate partner violence, for example, to understand structural racism and how the lived experiences of women across continents influence women's biology, women's physiology, and health outcomes. The science is integrative, and this is the examples that I want to share with you. So let me explain again why I focused on these conditions and integrated across several different disciplines and platforms. So I chose to focus my attention on preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. Let me talk about preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is a silent killer. 4.5% of pregnancies, approximately 4.5% of pregnancies worldwide. That amounts to 10 million women every year are affected by this condition. And that's 76,000 maternal deaths occur annually and 500,000 infant deaths. Preeclampsia is one of the leading causes of perinatal mortality across the globe. In Latin America, for example, preeclampsia is the #1 cause of maternal deaths. Women in developing countries overall are 7 times more likely than women in developed countries to develop preeclampsia. But here's what makes preeclampsia more than a pregnancy complication and a particularly significant long-term concern. Preeclampsia is a sentinel event. Preeclampsia isn't just a pregnancy complication. It is a window into the women's future cardiovascular health. And this is really important as cardiovascular disorders are the #1 killer of women today. Women who develop preeclampsia, for example, have a significant elevated risk for heart disease, for stroke, and hypertension later in life. So pregnancy becomes, in effect, a stress test that reveals underlying susceptibilities to what I have been now thinking as accelerated aging and manifest by the accumulation of cardiovascular disorders and of premature morbidity because of these disorders. This means to me, and I hope to you, that understanding preeclampsia in pregnancy helps us prevent cardiovascular disease in the long term. This condition, in my view, exemplifies why women's health research benefits everyone. Okay, now I want to talk about gestational diabetes. Gestational diabetes is actually far more prevalent than preeclampsia. It is now affecting about 14% of pregnancies globally, and that number is rising in parallel with obesity and with the rising incidence and prevalence of type 2 diabetes. In the United States alone, the direct cost for managing gestational diabetes is $1.6 billion annually. But the true burden in this case, in this disorder, extends far beyond the direct costs because gestational diabetes creates a cascade of impacts. Let me explain what that means. Pregnancies complicated by gestational diabetes have an increased risk of hypertensive disorders in the pregnancy, preterm delivery, cesarean birth, and a wide variety of neonatal complications. For mothers, having gestational diabetes dramatically increases the risk for developing type 2 diabetes later in life. In fact, between 30 and 70% of women with a history of gestational diabetes will go on to develop type 2 diabetes within 10 years. We have known this particular elevated risk for decades, for at least 5 decades. Yet, the delivery of care across the globe for women with a history of gestational diabetes is not following a life course perspective where interventions, preventions could be put in place. There is a wonderful program here in the UK where the NHS has adopted following women with a history of gestational diabetes with the aim of preventing the incidence, the occurrence of type 2 diabetes. And the US could learn a lot by following that model. But gestational diabetes is also interesting because it's one of the pregnancy complications that is an example of the intergenerational transmission of disease. And what I mean by that is the mother's metabolic environment during pregnancy actually programs the child's metabolic system across that child's life course. So in managing and understanding and managing gestational diabetes, we're treating not just one patient, but we're actually shaping the health of future generations. And then I want to talk about the third complication of pregnancy. And I describe this as it's placental abruption. It is a leading cause of hemorrhage-related maternal mortality when the placenta separates prematurely from the uterine wall before delivery, leading to a bleeding hemorrhage catastrophe that impacts the life of mother and the baby. Unlike preeclampsia and gestational diabetes, this particular condition often has not been managed by early detection because abruption happens progresses quite rapidly. I also want to share with you that the perinatal mortality is 15 to 20 times higher for pregnancies affected by abruption compared to those without. And when I began my career in the mid-1990s, we knew very little about why some women would develop this devastating complication. And there's still a critical knowledge gap. Through the research networks I've developed over the last 3 decades, however, across 3 continents, we've been able to identify modifiable risk factors, including physical activity, patterns of nutrition, as well as the role of systemic inflammation, chronic inflammation that contributes to these. So I'd like to basically just quickly describe the 3-continent approach. Here's the principle that I've lived by throughout my career. When the same epidemiologic associations appear in Lima, in Harare, and Seattle, it's hard to ignore the pattern. And it allows us to be somewhat more confident that the associations we're seeing are true, real biological phenomena, not just confounding. Our research design involved parallel case control studies conducted simultaneously in the US, Zimbabwe, and Peru. And later we expanded this work to Thailand, where we were able to start doing groundbreaking research on looking at gum disease, periodontal disease, and its risk for pregnancy outcome. Why were we looking at periodontal disease? Largely because of the very strong connection of inflammation, and inflammation being a very strong underlying biological, pathophysiologic leader to the 3 disorders that I've been talking about. But most importantly, the cross-continent replication allow us to infer causality at a greater level of certainty. If we see the same patterns in populations with different diets, with different healthcare systems, with different environmental exposures, we reasoned that we could be more confident that the associations identified were genuinely true biological phenomena. So what did we find? I will share a little bit of what we found. Findings validated across all 3 study sites, or 4 study sites, said that dyslipidemia, abnormal lipid levels, chronic systemic inflammation, and oxidative stress, alterations in molecules related to fat metabolism, adipokines, as well as endothelial dysfunction, dysfunction of the lining of the vessels in our body, the blood vessel linings. All of these pointed to modifiable risk factors, things that we could potentially change, bringing about intervention to reduce the burden of these complications. These studies also led to the development of a more rigorous research platform, the Omega study, which is a prospective. Before I talked about case control studies. Now these case control studies brought about the support for much more expensive, much more detailed, long-term, 10-year National Institutes of Health funded study that fundamentally changed our understanding of modifiable risk factors for the pregnancy complications. And I'd like to share some of those findings with you. So one finding from this 10-year study was that vitamin C, we documented reduced preeclampsia risk with maternal preconception or early intake of foods and vegetables rich in vitamin C. This pointed to the importance of antioxidants in preventing oxidative stress associated with preeclampsia. Physical activity, regular recreational physical activity, we found was associated with a reduced risk of both preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. This finding was revolutionary at the time because at that time this work was being published, pregnant women were still being told by their care providers to rest, to not exercise, and we challenged decades of less restricted, ill-advised advice. Early metabolic markers, by having pre-clinical blood samples, we were able to look for biomarkers in the blood that would help us identify possible diagnostic early targets that would help us earlier detection and position us for risk stratification and intervention. The critical insights from this set of studies, this cohort study, was that if a metabolic disorder appeared before the clinical symptoms, this represented an opportunity to intervene before the condition fully developed. This shifted our thinking away from watching and waiting to thinking more proactively about prevention, intervention, and treatment. Now I'd like to talk about integrating the biochemistry and the molecular biology, because I think this is an important use of a platform of a cohort study. So the Omega study allowed us across, and our 3-continent research pointed us towards specific modifiable factors. And in this section, I'm going to share how our findings actually changed the way guidance was made for physical activity, sleep, and nutrition. Here, I want to discuss how the research radically shifted American College of Gynecology and Obstetrics guidance. In 1985, the ACOG, or the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, recommended exercise duration less than 15 minutes. Inactive women were discouraged from starting exercise during pregnancy, and bed rest was commonly prescribed for a variety of pregnancy clinical conditions. However, by 2020, ACOG had changed completely its recommendation. It had completely reversed the 1985 recommendation and now recommended that 30 to 60 minutes of moderate physical leisure exercise 2 to 7 days per week were advised, and that exercise and basically adopted the reporting of information that exercise reduced gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and cesarean delivery risk. Our research, both the case control studies across the continents, but also the Omega study, was instrumental in driving the reversal of the unfortunate notion that sedentary lifestyle was indicated in pregnancy. And in 2017, meta-analyses confirmed that 30 to 60 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise engaged 2 to 7 times per week significantly reduced these metabolic complications of pregnancy. This is the kind of rigorous epidemiologic evidence built over time that's necessary for changing clinical practice and policies. And the similar evolution occurred here in the UK with the NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence guidelines in the UK, However, the implementation of these findings in practice is inconsistent across the NHS trust. Now I want to move to sleep. I want to look at sleep. It's interesting. Prior to the start of our work, sleep epidemiology was really a rare finding in the study of pregnancy and women's health. And our research revealed, not surprisingly, if you had the data, you would have a chance to see this, that short sleep duration, that's less than 6 hours of sleep on average per night, is associated with an increased risk of gestational diabetes and preeclampsia. Now, we knew this to be true for the non-pregnancy conditions of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension. But the literature for pregnant women was virtually null void until the work was paid attention to by our group and others in the mid-90s. Poor sleep quality, we know, is linked now to adverse pregnancy outcomes, including preterm birth, impacting the child's health and time at delivery. And it's also not just the matter of the duration of sleep that's important, but the quality of the sleep matters as well. Our studies in Peru also identified that there's a high risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and placental abruption for women who have obstructive sleep apnea. That's snoring, okay? It's just the highfalutin word for snoring, obstructive sleep apnea. And obstructive sleep apnea, or snoring, is much more common among overweight and obese individuals. And so it was particularly concerning that snoring, obstructive sleep apnea, was increasing in prevalence among reproductive age women because of the increasing prevalence of pre-pregnancy obesity. And the mechanism is straightforward now that we have the evidence and we have the data. The mechanism is that we know sleep affects nearly every metabolic and hormonal system. Poor sleep leads to increased inflammation. There we go again with excessive systemic inflammation being an underlying mechanism to poor health. We also know that poor sleep leads to disrupted glucose regulation and elevated cortisol, the stress hormones, and also impaired immune function. So sleep screening, as a result of the accumulation of evidence, is now recognized as an essential part of prenatal care. And the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, as well as other professional bodies, now recommend asking women about sleep duration and the quality of their sleep during pregnancy visits. Asking is one thing. A prescription for how to improve, however, is still work to be needed there. Okay, so I've talked about the modifiable lifestyle factors. We also developed new approaches for biomarker detection, and I'll just go through that fairly quickly. So we developed a perinatal biospecimen repository, essentially a blood bank, a tissue bank, where we saved samples collected early in pregnancy and went back to the repository to do nested case control studies of these samples so we could understand what the biochemical, genetic, genomic changes were prior to the onset of clinical disorders. This is crucial if we want to understand the biological changes that precede the disease diagnosis. And it's also important for us to understand the pathophysiologic mechanisms that might explain the associations we see in the epidemiologic studies. So we integrated into this research platform multi-omics approaches, which revealed complex biological pathways leading to pregnancy complications. But the ultimate measure in our science is whether all of this research improves lives. And what was important in a summary here is that physical activity guidelines, decades of restricted guidance, were reversed because of the work that was done, and sleep screening now recognized as essential. Intimate partner violence I want to talk about intimate partner violence screening, because when we started this work, there was very little empirical evidence around the burden of intimate partner violence experienced by pregnant women. And now, today, ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, actually recommends routine screening during prenatal care. And here I want to talk about social determinants of health and universal screening, very much important. So before I move on, the point I want to close this section with is discovery alone is not enough. Discovery is important. Discovery provides the evidence upon which change can happen at scale, but it's not enough. That the true measure of our science has to be evaluating how our science improves the lives of the people we serve. So I'll spend some time talking about structural determinants, because you will notice that the early parts of my talk, we're talking about individual behaviors and modifiable factors that the women can do before and during pregnancy. But it's really important to understand structural determinants, because the biomedical model focusing on individual biology and behavior is necessary but not sufficient for bringing about closing the health gaps. So to truly understand why some women are more vulnerable than others, we have to examine the structural determinants. In Peru, we understood from very not rigorous surveys that intimate partner violence was prevalent. But the obstetric community refused or hesitated in accepting this information because the studies had been done using a variety of instruments, and the methodologic approaches were questionable, and because of that, the organizations refused to act on the information available. And so there was a movement, partly supported by the World Health Organization, to standardize the way information about intimate partner violence was collected across multiple continents and across different social ethnic classes. And the WHO study actually finally changed people's mind about the burden of intimate partner violence in reproductive age women and even young girls. And following this path, we conducted a study of 6,000 women in Peru to look at the influence of intimate partner violence in a deep way, where we were looking at maternal physical health, mental health, and pregnancy outcomes. And the findings were devastating. In Peru, we found that 40% of pregnancy-related homicides are related to intimate partner violence. We also found that women experiencing intimate partner violence were 3.8 times more likely to have the odds of increased severe maternal morbidity. In the US, national surveys done show that physical intimate partner violence is about 5.5%, and in some settings, globally, the estimate is 9.3%. What's really important is those estimates there, 5.4 to 9.3, represent the prevalence of intimate partner physical violence. When we think about all forms of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, and financial violence, the prevalence of intimate partner violence, defined broadly, is 23%. So, a high prevalence, high burden, environmental exposure that is very much socially impacting women's biology, physiology. And the pathways of physical violence to adverse outcomes operates through a variety of mechanisms, including delayed prenatal care, poor nutrition, substance use disorders, chronic stress, inflammation, there we go again with inflammation, and ultimately manifesting in high maternal metabolic and risks, as well as adverse outcomes for the birth. So how How is structural violence embodied in the physiology? We can't ignore the fact that when we understand pregnancy outcomes associated with violence, we can't ignore the fact that the social context in which women become pregnant and carry their pregnancies to term are impacted by the violence. Violence affects biology through stress hormones, inflammation, behavioral changes, and the body keeps the score. That's the title of a book that, if any of you are interested, I would really recommend you to read it. It's controversial among people in the field of psychiatry, but it is an incredible read for those of us who are not psychiatrists and understand the impact and the imprint that violence has on our bodies. I want to spend a little time talking about racial and ethnic disparities. Here in the UK, Black women die 3 times the rate of white women in pregnancy and childbirth. And Asian women also face elevated risks. In the US, a large percent of racial and ethnic disparities in preterm birth, preeclampsia, are explained by social determinants of health. The McKinsey report estimates that 350,000 healthy life years were lost in 2025 for Black women alone due to maternal health disparities. And the financial cost, as I started to talk about in the beginning of this talk, of inadequate care, inadequate prenatal care is staggering. In the UK, 1.3 billion pounds in the UK maternity-related clinical negligence payments were made in 2024 and 25. That, I understand, is 42% of the total NHS negligence payment. 42%. This represents both a human tragedy as well as economic waste. These disparities, I again will argue, are not biological. They are the product of social factors, including racism, poverty, and inadequate access to quality health care. And addressing them will not require individual change, but will require systemic change and not just medical intervention. The integrative framework. Epidemiologic approaches demand that we look at multiple levels simultaneously. I hope I've persuaded you of this. We have to look at the individual level, diet, activity, sleep. We have to also look at the interpersonal levels. Here, intimate partner violence, social support, family stress. We have to look at the community level factors, neighborhood safety, food access, environmental exposures, where women live, where women's lives are affected by what they can access to eat and whether they can exercise safely and whether they are exposed to extreme air or noise or water pollution. And at the structural level, racism, poverty, healthcare access, and the policy environment are important determinants. These macro level factors really help to shape everything else. So the science has to be integrative, and I hope I've persuaded you of that. And most of our interventions must keep this complex milieu of causal factors in mind when we are trying to address these disparities. Remembering that focusing on individual behavior alone will not get us to where the gaps can be closed. Okay, I'm on section 5, and I want to talk a little bit about the exciting new research frontier that we all have ahead of us. When I completed my doctoral studies in 1991, I could not have imagined the research that is now happening all around us. The field of epidemiology, for instance, has been transformed by artificial intelligence and the embrace of real-world evidence and a radically new vision of public, private, and academic partnerships. Research that I thought was impossible in the early 90s are now happening all around us. And I want to share with you the Apple Women's Health Study, which is a digital cohort study that I have the privilege of designing and co-leading with my colleagues at Harvard. The study is the first of its kind. It's a long-term research study of a scale that was unimaginable in the early 1990s, especially that it focuses specifically on women's menstrual cycle and gynecologic conditions. And the thought here was that we are unable to adequately diagnose high burden conditions like endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome because we don't have a basic understanding of what is normal and out of normal range in a woman's menstrual cycle across her life's course. And so this radical study, simply a basic study trying to understand women's menstrual cycle. And to do this in a way where we adopt the idea that the menstrual cycle should be treated like a vital sign. The study represents an unlikely and untypical, at the time, partnership of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, Apple, and the National Institutes of Health. I will tell you, it took 18 months to get through all of the legal and administrative processes to allow this partnership to go forward, but it was worth the wait. And it couldn't happen if there was not mutual trust across the three sectors and the commitment to do something that had never been done before. The research scope is unprecedented. Using digital technology, health surveys are administered quarterly to assess time-varying factors like sleep and physical activity and nutrition, and stress exposures and substance use. Extensive health overviews are done through the access of electronic medical records that women share with us with consent. And the data from wearables give us continuous real-time information that we're still struggling with in understanding. Don't get me wrong, sensor data is about the messiest data that I've encountered, and I'm just so glad that we have young scholars who are fearless in data science, who are willing to spend time and their talent in unlocking the potential that these sensor data provide. But the study demonstrates a new model for women's health research that we can scale in ways that I could not have imagined in 1990. We now have something like 130,000 women enrolled in the study. The study started months before the pandemic when we went on lockdown. And because it was all digital, the study continued while we were all resting in place. And that really helped because the data we were accruing, we were able to ask and answer questions specific and relevant to the COVID period. What's really important about this study is that we and others who have now adopted the digital era in integrating into epidemiological research can build robust, generalizable knowledge bases that include information on populations that have previously been hard to reach. Not to say that we've reached everyone, because not everyone can afford an Apple Watch or an Apple phone, but we were able to reach women at a scale that no study looking at menstrual cycle patterns had ever done before. So like I mentioned, we have 130,000 women enrolled in the study, and we're already generating new findings. For example, we've documented that polycystic ovary syndrome is linked to a 4-fold increased risk in endometrial hyperplasia. We've shown that early menarche has occurred across generations from 1950 to 2005. Our genetics haven't changed, but the onset of menarche has changed in remarkable ways. Largely, this data is pointing to environmental endocrine disruptors that we have to do more deep research to understand. We also understand that the menstrual cycle is generally shorter at different times of the year, and that it's particularly disrupted, the menstrual cycle length pattern, for women who go on to develop polycystic ovary syndrome. So we're learning a lot, but the most important point I want to share is that the public, the private, and the academic partnership model can be replicated and is being replicated for many other understudied conditions. And academic rigor combined with technological innovation and resources at scale is the future for population health research. How far have we come? Here we have a transformation in our research capabilities. I mentioned artificial intelligence. Enables pattern recognition in complex biological data that humans can't detect, and prediction models for adverse pregnancy outcome that enables earlier detection. Real-world data, the flow from electronic medical records and from sensors create an opportunity for us to ask and answer a variety of questions that we can now have objective evidence, objective streams of data to help us. I am excited about the application of digital twin technology, computational models that can not only model individual physiologic change, but change at a community level. If we have good quality data and create a digital twin, we should be able to evaluate the unanticipated as well as anticipated impacts of social or policy changes at a community level. I want to emphasize that these tools are not replacing epidemiology and researchers. They're actually helping to amplify the work that we do. And the fundamentals, though, remain the same, and that is rigorous study design, careful attention to bias, and appropriate statistical methods must be maintained at all levels. Okay, the architecture for discovery. Discovery alone, as I mentioned, is not enough. The true measure of our science is whether it improves the lives of the people we serve. And here I want to return to the economic case because I want it to stay with you as a result of this lecture. Remember, $1 trillion annually by 2040 can be added to the global economy by closing the women's health gap. Where does this number come from? $400 billion from fewer health conditions enabling productivity. The equivalent impact of gaining a full-time economic participation for 137 million women. And a 3-to-1 return on investment. For every dollar invested in closing the women's health gap, according to the Gates Foundation, there's a $3 return. It's important to recognize that investing in women's health isn't strategy. It isn't charity. It is actually an investment with extraordinary return. And this is an audience that I think can appreciate that part of the narrative in support of closing the women's health gap. And the Global Alliance for Women's Health launched at Davos, a very important platform where leaders in the economic and civic sectors come together. The private sector, civil society, and governments come together and commit to closing the gap. This reflects, in my view, a growing recognition that women's health is everybody's business. Just quickly, the UK data are striking. Again, 11 billion pounds annually represents the economic cost of absenteeism due to menstrual pain, endometriosis, fibroids, and ovarian cysts. 1.5 billion pounds annually represents the direct economic impact of unemployment due to menopausal symptoms. 60,000 women are not in employment due to menopause symptoms in the UK today. 60,000. 8.1 billion pounds per year, the cost of perinatal mental health problems. 8.1 billion, the cost of perinatal maternal mental health problems. And 72% of that cost is actually due to the child's, another example of intergenerational transmission. And what's the return on investment in this space? 11-to-1. For every pound spent on obstetrics and gynecology, the return is 11. By any standard, that is an extraordinary ROI. And what's the cost of failure? This is important. Again, 1.3 billion pounds maternal-related clinical negligence payments, or 42% of NHS negligence payments in 2024 to 2025. When I look at that number, it not only represents a human tragedy, it represents a colossal waste of resources. So investing in women's health isn't an additional cost. It shouldn't be looked at it as an additional cost. Look at investing in women's health as a way to reduce burden. And look at investment in women's health as recognizing prevention is cheaper than treatment. Good maternity care, good women's health care is cheaper than treatment. So what needs to change? I want to leave you with 5 imperatives. First, count women. Invest in better data collection to reveal the real burden. Second, study women. Fund research in female-specific health concerns and sex-based differences. Third, care for women. Ensure clinical guidelines reflect best practices tailored for women's unique needs. Fourth, invest in women. Recognize the $1 trillion opportunity for economic growth. And fifth, include all women. Address disparities by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And I would say particularly important in the United States, immigration status as well. The benefits of improved women's health must reach everyone, not just those with privilege and resources. And as Lucy Perez of McKinsey Health Research says, it is time to count women, study women, care for women, invest in women, and include all women. We can close the gap, and now we know what's at stake. Again, women spend 25% more of their lives in poor health. That's 9 years on average in debilitating conditions. They live longer than men, but much of that is time spent in an unwell state. 95% of women's health burden comes from conditions that affect both men and women, but impact women differently. Heart disease, mental health conditions, autoimmune disorders affect women differently. And only 5% of the differences in women's health gap comes from sex-specific conditions. And then finally, discovery is not enough. The true measure of our science is whether it improves the lives of those we serve. Epidemiology gave me the platform. Biochemistry and genomics gave me the tools to understand mechanism. But it was the attention to the social determinants of health, to intimate partner violence, to structural racism, and to the lived experience of women across the continents that revealed why some women are more vulnerable than others. So I'd like to close with, we study to understand, we understand to act, and we act to improve lives. I share with you this quote from Louis Pasteur. To him who devotes his life to science, nothing can give more happiness than increasing the number of discoveries. But his cup of joy is full when the results of his studies immediately find practical applications. Now, you've seen on this slide that I've taken the liberty of making Pasteur's words, how dare I, more inclusive. And I've done that because to her who devotes her life to science, because the wisdom applies equally to all of us. Him, her, she, he, who have chosen this path. Our cup of joy, of full discovery, leading to action when science improves lives. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank again the Department of Health Policy and all of you for the engagement that we have today. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Michelle. We have some time for questions, and I'm sure you have a lot of them. What we'll do is we'll take one at a time. I'll take 3 from the room first of all, and then we also have people online. So every 4th question I'll take from those online. So if you're online and wish to pose a question, please put it in the chat, and it'll be sent on to us. So if you could just, when I point to who's going to ask the first question, could you just say your name and then ask a brief question? So somebody at the very back, wait for the microphone to come, and please speak clearly into the microphone, particularly so that, well, so that Michelle can hear, but also so that those online can hear as well.
Hi, my name is Tom Cares. My question would be more about digital twins. If we were in like the most ultimate sci-fi utopia type situation, and we could do literally anything.
Could you say that again, Tom?
My question is relating to like the whole digital twin idea. If we were like in the most utopian theoretical sci-fi situation where we could do anything at all, what would be, do you think, ideal to do using digital twinning to optimize women's health?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. Can you hear me? So I became increasingly concerned that I kept hearing clinicians talk about digital twins in oncology, just in the space of patient care. And as a public health, population health person, I kept thinking, why would you restrict this amazing tool, which in my view is an analytic kind of scenario building testing tool, where you can create a digital twin, not only of an individual, and evaluate which molecules might actually cure the cancer, but you could also create a digital twin of a community and evaluate how policies might impact different parts of the community. So the example that I like to think about, because we're building use cases now to show how digital twin can inform good decision-making at the population level in women's health, but in health in general, is by working with state health departments who have to make rapid decisions during climate crises, like extreme heat events or extreme heat events compounded by wildfires. And what we're doing is working with state health departments, the owner of a lot of the data that's necessary for making decisions about where to put cooling centers, how to support the workforce during these heat events. So that's an example. There are other examples emerging in the literature, but my goal is that we should use these tools not only in one-on-one clinical care, but also at the level of decision-making and decision analysis at the population level.
Great, thank you, Tom. Yeah, I'll take one question here, and then after that we'll go here, but we'll take one at a time.
Hi, Ella here. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for your work. My question, I in Imperial work with multi-omics and drug discovery. So when we're talking about the repository that you're building, how close we are from the signal to noise ratio to actually bring up the correlation between the causation. And that leads to my second quick point is, I am working with 2 startups, one in UK and one in Switzerland, that are building their own data repository. There are 4 other startups that I'm working that are working in the PCOS environment. What is your perspective in terms of all the work that is happening globally to come together? Because surely we could leverage the data that we're collecting.
Yeah.
And thank you again.
That's a great question. So, you know, causal inference is really hard, right? And we hold each other accountable to do the most rigorous and robust study we can, but we also hold each other accountable for being really transparent about where the limitations are. And so I think causal inference really comes from replication and rigor and reproducibility, first thing. Second thing is I think it's really important that we find ways to honor the data governance, regulation, and requirements, but to, when we can, harmonize data and aggregate data across geopolitical, social, racial, ethnic divides. And I'm again excited about the future because there are now increasingly analytic techniques and data governance techniques that would allow us to bypass the 2 years data use agreement. I mean, literally, right? 18 months to 2 years to get data use agreements signed, to create an environment where synthetic data generation, another hi-fi, high science craziness that no one thought about in 1991, but increasingly we're turning to that as a way to overcome the structural and regulatory barriers of trading or sharing data, and doing so in a way where we can generate a synthetic version of data, bringing all different units together and analyzing. I say this with some caution, because there's still a lot of pressure testing and validation that needs to be done. But I think the future is bright for us doing that kind of work. The concern I have is the Switzerlands of the world, the Northern European parts of the world, and the North American part of the world will come together. What I really worry about is the opportunity to bring the rest of the planet together. And that's going to require significant investment in baseline and bringing them up. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. There was a question just here. Thank you.
Hiya, my name's Kate. I was just wondering, even to illustrate my question, the demographics based on sex in this room, we see that there are a lot more women than men here today. And I think what we see is a dearth of male interest in women's health problems. And so how do you communicate both the need for research and the findings of that research to the halls of bureaucratic and political power that are also characterized by a gendered demographic difference?
The echo in this room is really hard.
Can you just ask the question again, Kate, please?
I was wondering how you would recommend translating and communicating the need for and the results of scientific research to the often male-dominated halls of political and bureaucratic power to ensure that it genuinely influences policy development.
That's a really great question. And I think in my own journey, what I discovered was to diversify the argument. And I hope you saw my approach to diversifying the argument, to talk about not only the moral imperative and the social justice imperative of the work, but to communicate to those who are only moved by the financial arguments to recognize that everyone loses as a result of this persistent gap in women's health compared to men's health. This is something I've discovered not only in the context of women's health gap, but in health disparities gap altogether. The economic analyses of the cost of disparities, whether it be by sex or by race, ethnicity, is phenomenal. And I think the way to engage people is to meet them where they are. And if they need to hear the financial argument, give it to them. If they need to hear the social moral imperative, give it to them. What does that mean? Then you're communicating to more people, and there is substantial overlap for those who are moved by one or the other, or both. In the middle of the pandemic, I watched a health economist from Citigroup sitting in place, all by herself, looking at the health disparity of the COVID burden in the United States. And this economist did something that blew my mind. She went with her little team in Citigroup and calculated what the cost to the United States was for the persistence of racial health disparities. And it was something like $4 trillion over 10 years that all of us, no matter our skin color or social class, was losing to the American GDP because of persistent health disparities. I love this work so much, I was on the phone to her the next week, bringing her into the School of Public Health to talk about this. Because we in public health, during my career, we didn't talk about this in that way. And so I think what we have to do is be smarter about the audience we're trying to communicate. And if we're successful, I think we'll get people on board no matter their motivation.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. Right, there's a question from online from Akisha Odette, who asks, what are the key metabolic markers and tests that a woman needs prior to pregnancy, and when is it too late for these, and what is the optimal time?
That's a great
So
question. Yeah. I believe in life course health. I work with an epidemiologist who believes strongly in the intergenerational association. And he actually ran a study that looked at the mother, the grandmother's health, influencing her daughter's health, influencing the newborn health. We have to think about health and wellness as intergenerational. And Irvin Manuel is the person I'm invoking here. His argument was that the health of a woman today is dependent on the health of women before her mother and her grandmother. How do we know this? Do any of you remember the diethyl stilbestrol tragedy? That was one of the first real tangible examples of the intergenerational impact of what happens to the mother, influences the daughter, influences the daughter's children, and now follow-up studies are looking at that next generation, that fourth generation. There is always an important opportunity to protect, promote, and preserve health across the full life course. If one is contemplating and thinking about pregnancy and want to understand their health status and pre-gestational health risk, I think a regular health checkup where you're looking at your lipids, you're looking at your glucose control, you're looking at your blood pressure, and you're managing your weight so that obesity-related adverse pregnancy outcomes are not a big problematic cause. But if you're doing that a year before you're planning pregnancy, my argument would be do it your life course. It's a life course endeavor.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Right, I'll take 3 more from the room. Constance here, and then I'll take this one in the corner there, and I want one from this side here. Yes. Constance, please.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for this. Question maybe relating to the one Kate asked earlier. We live in quite turbulent times. DEI considerations are more politically contentious than ever, which affects both women, ethnic minorities, and people at the intersection of this. So with the changing role of regulators, I wanted to know from you, have we made the economic case for the industry yet? Have we made the economic case that it's worthwhile investing in women's health or in these diversity considerations more broadly? And what can we as the academic community do to make that case continuously?
Yeah, that's a pointed question and an important one. And I'll point to how the World Economic Forum made this. First, it used its convening power to put women's health on the map, where government leaders, private sector, Fortune 500 company CEOs gather, and philanthropy gather. But the other thing that was really important, and I experienced this in 2016 when the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the United States decided that they wanted to encourage people to, especially CEOs, to think about the culture of health and how that impacts their bottom line. So the then president of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation convened meetings at the Harvard Business School of all places. Not the School of Public Health, because many of those CEOs probably wouldn't come to the School of Public Health, but they would come to Harvard Business School. And this convening, sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, led a very open and intimate discussion about the cost of absenteeism and presentism, pronounce that right, I think, when your employees are struggling with preventable chronic illnesses of their own and of their family members. I thought that was another mind-blowing experience, because here now, the employers who are often the payers for health care, very high insurance coverage in the United States, we're now being made aware of the cost, the actual cost to their productivity, to their annual income, because they were having loss of productivity due to their workforce being saddled with preventable chronic disease, and worse, their family members also being. So we were educating them, taking the public health message to the business school, and we were basically saying, you CEOs, you're in the public health business, whether you know it or not. And here's how your public health role looks like. You can pay and support health promotion, disease prevention, workplace interventions, and get more out of it and pay less for it. And your workforce is healthier. So that is the kind of creative, inclusive thinking that public health is everyone's business. And it's hiding in plain sight. And it just took changing the narrative.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Okay, one in the corner here.
Thank you. My name is Noor, and I'm someone who's very, very interested in the field of obstetrics and gynecology, and I really hope to contribute to this field of research when I move on to university, hopefully. And I know many young people my age and younger than me and older than me that are very invested in this field of research. So I wanted to ask, what is your message to young people who are looking to contribute to the closing of the gender health gap and this sector of research in general?
The digital health gap?
The gender health gap.
The gender health gap. You know, I think the message is to stay involved. Right now, I think there are lots of barriers to engagement in global health, in women's health gap. There's a lot of barriers, especially in the United States right now, to investment in closing the racial and ethnic health disparities. My advice to our junior faculty who've spent their early parts of their training and now their career in positioning to address these gaps are that they are at risk because funding for their work is diminished. But I will say that while the words are being scrubbed from the applications, the commitment and the ethic remains the same. And that is public health means not prioritizing one over the other, but ensuring that we are bringing about an environment that enables all people, everyone, to thrive. And I've watched institutions after institutions in the United States change the name in response to the administration's reaction to certain words, and to then say what they mean, and that is to advance human thriving for all. And I think that's the best thing that I can say right now, given the unique political place where we are, at least in the US.
Great, thank you very much, Noor. And one question here, and then I'll take one online.
Hi, my name's Clara. I found it really interesting that you spoke about the use of, or at least the use of utilizing the relationship between the private, public and academic sector. And this sounds like quite an inflammatory question, and I don't mean it to, but do you believe that you can close the gender health gap without having a nationalized health service?
Well, Barack Obama tried. And he made a few concessions that I think he had to do to get the first iteration going. I know it's a politically fraught problem. I think we have to find a way to make it work in the US, because I don't see universal coverage happening anytime soon. And so I think we have to use all of the tools in our toolkit to raise awareness, particularly around what I believe is true, and that is these gaps cost everyone. And if we can communicate that these gaps are costly, then I hope that the payers and the providers will come together and be more rational about healthcare delivery. And when that rational healthcare delivery includes prevention, proactive preservation of health and wellness, as opposed to expensive, late, reactive acute care, we're going to be in a bad situation in the US where we're spending $4 trillion a year and we are sinking to the bottom of all OECD countries. The estimate is that our life expectancy will drop continually and we will rank 55th in the world by 2040, despite all the money we spend on acute care that's not making us any healthier.
Thank you, Clara, for raising that. Right, there's a quite challenging question from online from Gabri Kirkendall. She asked, there's two questions. Could you speak to fears from women to share data for studies such as the Apple study, given current political climates that the data could be used politically to restrict abortion access and further regulate women's bodies? And how do you respond to these fears at the same time as needing to close the gender gap?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's one that we reflect on and act on regularly because we believe in the informed consent process, and we have a rigorous informed consent process where we make the commitment that data won't be shared. I will share with you that the Apple Women's Health Study is not funded, not a dollar of it is funded by the federal government. And I actually balked when we were setting up this collaboration that we would not engage federal research dollars in this endeavor. But in retrospect, with the Dobbs decision coming from the federal government reversing the right for abortion care, I discovered that that was a very wise decision because even if we were subpoenaed, we would not have to give information. Now, I will tell you that when the Dobbs decision came about, we thought women would withdraw from the study, would ask to have their data destroyed. We actually saw the opposite. More women joined the study because they understood from our informed consent process and our commitment to confidentiality and that we wouldn't share the data. So we've not been impacted, and there is a strong commitment by Harvard and by Apple that this information would not be handed over for any political reasons. It's a very important question, and I will say we watched very carefully how women respond to engagement with the study over the period of time. And I think we've been successful in assuring women that their data are protected and they're not put in harm's way by participating.
Great, thank you. Now, we're almost out of time. I think I can take two more questions. So we'll have one here and, yeah, in the back there as well. So just say your name and then one right at the back. Yeah, this in the grey.
Hi there. So in global health, we often see conditions with, which remain under-researched in high-income countries become even more invisible in lower resource settings. In the case of diseases like endometriosis, do you think closing research and funding gaps in wealthier health systems is an indispensable prerequisite for meaningful global progress, or can those efforts realistically develop in parallel, at least to some extent?
I have just the question part of that again. Could you repeat?
Sorry, if you think that closing research and funding gaps in wealthier health systems is an indispensable prerequisite for meaningful global progress, or can those efforts realistically develop in parallel, at least to some extent?
In parallel in low-income countries? Yes. So I believe strongly that the answers to many of the questions that we have around women's health will not necessarily flow from the global north down to the global south. I think we have to be really aware of the fact that there's a lot of talent in the global south and that we can have actually a closing of the gap by supporting and enabling science to flow in both directions. We saw this in the early parts of the COVID diagnostics rush. I like to remind people that when the Omicron variant became apparent that we were going to have a second surge of COVID, that information came from research labs in Botswana. And that was, for me, a beautiful example of information, surveillance, good science from the global south, helping the global north respond and react to what would have been a second resurgence of the COVID pandemic. So I believe strongly. The problem that we face is that the opportunities and the resources are not evenly distributed. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that capacity building and intentional support of a research infrastructure in the global south needs to be developed. And again, all of us will benefit if we have a more democratized distribution of opportunities for good science to happen.
Excellent, thank you. And just a final question at the back.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Bokan, and I just have a question about how you would reckon quantifying the gaps in women's research caused by the moral and ethical dilemma.
Yeah,
sorry.
Just that's,
Can you hear me?
Not very easily.
Not very easily. As you continue, I can't hear. So
okay.
Could you actually just stand up? Maybe that might help a little bit.
Don't mind me, I'm just reading it off I had to formulate my words. But my name is Bokan, thank you for your talk. And I just wanted to ask how you can quantify the gaps in women's research caused by the moral and ethical dilemma of the exclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials, and how we're navigating away from off-label use with drugs that we don't know if they have teratogenic impacts, such as GLP-1 agonists. So how to encourage pharmaceutical companies from a financial standpoint, as well as people of a reproductive age from a humanity perspective, to propagate research into the safe inclusion of testing.
Yeah, I lecture about this a lot, and I use the DES example and the thalidomide example as you know, because those two crises really resulted in a reflex reaction of not engaging and enrolling women in clinical trials. And we are still living through the legacy of this, because there was a reflex of not including women in clinical trials. And even just 3-4 years ago in the COVID vaccine testing, pregnant women were not enrolled in these trials. And so as the evidence showed the efficacy and safety of the vaccine in non-pregnant individuals, primary care docs and OBGYNs had to go by the seat of their pants, you know, and had to go by secondary analysis of trial data where women were pregnant and accidentally vaccinated. Not the right environment for causal inference. But that's where we were just 5 years ago. And so I can't reconcile the status quo of excluding women from clinical trials as an appropriate way to go. I think what we have to do is we have to get over the history that led us to where we are, where women were excluded. It wasn't until 1991 that the federal government in the United States mandated that federal research dollars would not flow to researchers if women were excluded from studies where they should have been included. But it wasn't until 1997 that when women were included in studies, the data were disaggregated so we could look at women specific. So we've got a lot of work still to do, but your question about clinical trials is an important one. And I think what we have to do is build an evidence base and a regulatory science ecosystem that allows for the timely and safe enrollment of women in studies despite of their pregnancy status.
Great, thanks very much, Bohan. And thank you all for being here this evening, both online and in person. I'd like you all to join with me to thank Michelle for coming all this way.